what's up, St. Theresa? My name is Chase Krause, Director of Youth and Young Adult Ministry here at St. Theresa Catholic Church and School, and welcome to this series of St. Theresa Roundtable. We're out of Father Larry's office and back to our small round table. And this mini-series, we're actually going to be talking about a few really interesting things. We are joined by our very, very special guest, Mr. Ryan Pollock, who's just moved here. And so, Ryan, thanks for coming on. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, brother. Great to be here.
Before we dive into everything, why don't you just tell us kind of a bit about yourself, a bit about your background, kind of how you ended up here at St. Teresa's.
Sure, absolutely. So I am part of Father Larry's latest collection, the latest piece in Father Larry's collection. So I used to be an Episcopal priest. I was an Episcopal priest for about 3 years before I realized that the Catholic Church was where not only the church that Jesus founded, but I guess then by necessity, the church that I needed to belong to. So that was right before the COVID-19 happened. So this was like fall of 2019. We realized that we needed to convert. And then, of course, everything in the world hit the fan, and our plans were sort of sidetracked there for a little bit. But when I left resigned my orders as an Episcopal priest, and this interesting sounding sales job opened up in Austin, and by then I had been unemployed for a couple of months. I picked the wrong time for a career change in world history. That was a wild ride there. And so I thought, sales, okay, I can do that. And so it was also an opportunity to move back to Austin, and I'm from here originally, though I've been gone for about 11 years, recently back. And so we moved back to Austin, and I realized that I'm terrible at sales. It's a good time to realize it when you're right in the thick of it. People would tell me no, and I would just be like, well, I see your point, I guess.
Yeah, you're right. This is not a good product. Don't buy my stuff.
This doesn't seem like a good fit for you. And so I was in the middle of that, and we were trying to figure out what parish we would go to. We actually live a little bit closer to St. Thomas More, but technically we're in St. Teresa's parish. And so we came here one day, and I recognized J.D. McQueen, our director of liturgy, actually, because he, of course, used to be an Episcopal priest, and he had a ministry in San Diego, and we were almost neighbors in ministry once upon a time. I almost took a job right next to where he was. And so I was like, I remember that guy. What's he doing here? And so we went out to lunch, and we got to know each other a little bit. And he was like, yeah, I'm actually the second former Episcopal priest on staff.
We're stacking them up here.
And it's part of the collection. Father Larry's going to taxidermy all of us. And so he said, you got to meet Father. And so we did, and had a great conversation. And then I guess Sister Ann retired, and they needed somebody to fill that role. And so Sister Ann's shoes are, of course, impossible to fill, and not just because they're too small for me, but because she's just a very holy lady. And so we came and tried to do a little bit of that, and also parish life. So I'm the director of senior adult ministry, which is straightforward enough, and then parish life. So any project that regards the parish as a whole. So right now we're looking at our stewardship program for the fall, trying to tweak and upgrade our outreach ministries and things like that.
That's awesome.
So that's a quick little nutshell, lightning round version of how we got here.
So you're kind of like fresh off the boat Catholic, which is awesome.
I'm still trying to find my way through the immigration line and figure out where everything is, and learning to speak the language and all of that.
So I remember actually one of the first times we met, I had offhandedly mentioned Divine Mercy, just not even thinking about it. And I remember you looked at me like, I don't know.
Saint Faustina.
Yeah. And I was just like, oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah. That's it's just as a Catholic, it's just kind of everyone knows about Divine Mercy.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So I had seen the Divine Mercy painting before, of course. Yeah. So I'd seen the Rainbow Jesus all over the place, but I didn't quite connect that to the diary of this particular saint.
Yeah. Well. So in this mini series, I thought it would be cool for us to talk about kind of the Catholic Church's relationship with our non-Catholic Christian brothers and sisters, right? Because that's looked kind of weird over the past, 1,000+ years. It's looked different in different periods of time, but today, it makes sense, I guess, to me, and we were talking about this before, is before we kind of get into ecumenism, kind of what that looks like, and even like evangelizing our Protestant brothers and sisters, I think, need a background of Protestantism in general. And as a Catholic, I have kind of one lens that I see the Reformation through, that I just, you hear about it, you kind of see, these people broke off, these people are schismatic, all these things. But yeah, from your perspective though, like, as somebody who grew up not Catholic, like, what did the Reformation look like from y'all's point of view? Because I think as Catholics, like, we don't ask that question enough, right? Like, we just assume that, they're protesting Catholicism, that's why they're called Protestants, and blah, 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 they're all, all these things. But I think it'd be cool for our viewers, and even for myself, like, as a former non-Catholic, like, what was the Reformation like from y'all's point of view?
Well, I think what Catholics often lose sight of is there's not just one thing called the Protestant Reformation, right? I mean, so to speak about it generally, we can say that, but the Reformation in England looked very different from the Reformation in Germany and in Geneva and France and all these places. So there were, at this time in the 16th century, there are different political movements and different religious movements that we can all sort of put under the umbrella of the Protestant Reformation. So it kind of just depends on what Protestant you're talking about, because they all had their particular issues with the Catholic Church at this or that time. But in general, we can say that the Protestant Reformation, when looked at from a Protestant perspective, a key word to use there is recovery, right? It was a great recovery of the original, I think the solas are a great way to think about it. So the solas, sola fide, sola gratia, sola deo gloria, all of those things. It's an attempt for Protestants recover what they think the Catholic Church lost over the centuries and millennia here. So it kind of depends on who you ask. But if you ask Lutherans are going to talk about how it was Martin Luther who discovered this forgotten bit of the gospel that the church had either was ignorant of or tried to suppress or something. He's bringing that out. So it's a bringing out of the church's storehouse things at once old and new, right? So it's a kind of, there's a romantic kind of recovery of the ancient Christian message and gospel and sources that we're going to bring out in these particular ways. And it's the Catholic Church's fault because they didn't listen to us, right? They either, like I said, they were ignorant of these, or they tried to suppress these, or there was a bringing together of far too much power in the office of the Roman pontiff. There was a kind of crystallizing, a kind of bringing together of a lot of different factors there in his office that caused him and the church by extension to forget their original mission. So Protestants at large think about it that way.
Yeah. So you mentioned that different countries kind of view it different ways, and so obviously as a former Episcopalian priest or Anglican, but not in England kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that looked different too, because that was more of a state, like the country itself broke away. So I know you're probably the most familiar with that branch of. So I guess for viewers who don't know about the Anglican portion of that, King Henry and all that kind of craziness. Like, so from us, we see King Henry as just like a punk who's just like, dude, like he just wanted a divorce, like you're just a bum, know. So like, but from y'all's perspective, like what did you learn about like why the Church of England?
Well, yeah. So in King Henry's earlier life, he's called by one of the popes, whose name I can't remember, the Defender of the Faith, which is actually still a part of the Monarch of England's heraldic titles. So even Queen Elizabeth today is still called somewhere in that long list of titles, the Defender of the Faith.
Oh, that's funny.
The popes have since rescinded that title, but they decided to keep it. But in the case of Henry, he initially wanted an annulment. Because he thought that he had violated he thought he was cursed because he couldn't produce a male heir. And he thought he had violated some kind of obscure prohibition against marrying your brother's widow in Old Testament law somewhere. So he's trying to account for that. So he writes the Pope asking for an annulment, It's not like the Pope hadn't granted an annulment to a head of state before. That's a common enough thing. Sure. But in Henry's case, he was just like, nah, pal, I don't think so. I don't see it. And so Henry writes what's called the Act of Supremacy, a subtly named little document.
Yeah, that's right. Very casual, very subtle.
Where he essentially says, well, I'm not just the head of state, I'm the head of the church. And he had seen precedent for this sort of thing in the churches of the East, where you have ancient Eastern emperors calling for church councils. So again, there's a little bit of precedence there. But to just sort of like Heisman the Pope and be like, no, I'm the head of both the church and the state now, is what leads to the Reformation there. So all that to say, King Henry is in a lot of ways a theological, except for his dismissal of the Pope, he's kind of like a theological conservative who makes some politically liberal moves and distancing himself from the Pope that way. So the Anglicans write what later come to be called the 39 Articles, where they say that the Pope has no jurisdiction in the realm of England and that this responsibility belongs to the king.
Interesting.
Now, so all that is to say that Anglicans don't really have a unifying theologian to rally around the way Lutherans do, the way Calvinists do. To be an Anglican is just to be a part of the Ecclesia Anglicana, the Church of England. So it's a geographical name. Now, of course, the paths diverge, because even though Henry wanted to keep some semblance of Catholicism, his heirs and his archbishops of Canterbury that he appoints don't tend to follow him in that way.
Well, and I guess, and we've talked about this before, is so Anglicanism doesn't really exist outside of England, right?
At that point.
Yeah. So, but currently, like right now, so you said you're Episcopal, you were an Episcopal priest, so why wouldn't we call you an Anglican priest?
Oh, yeah. Well, once upon a time, if you remember your American history, it was not so cool to be in bed with the Church of England. It was not so cool to be buddies with English folks. So after the American Revolution, Anglicans, members of the Church of England who lived in the United States, took to calling themselves Episcopalians, which just means a church that has bishops. So the Protestant Episcopal Church in America is the Protestant church that has bishops in America, to kind of get ourselves a little bit of distance culturally and politically from England. Because bishops were, American Episcopalians had a really rough time getting bishops to come over here to consecrate new priests, because it was commonly thought that bishops were agents of the crown, so we couldn't really trust them, which in some sense was true. And so that name change is kind of confusing, because everywhere else in the world they would recognize what the term Anglican means.
Sure.
Here in the States, we kind of use them interchangeably, so it's complicated.
So, and then I guess, to kind of summarize, Reformation in general, I guess and this is a super loaded question, so sure, pick and choose as you will. So I guess for us as Catholics, what's important for us to know as we dialogue with non-Catholics insofar as how they regard us? And I know that looks different depending on what denomination, but I guess, maybe a broad stroke idea of like what we should keep in mind about this conversation, or, maybe thinking about, well, with this denomination, think this, or this denomination, think this. Or
So one of the biggest points that attracted me to the Catholic Church is one of the biggest sticking points that a lot of Protestants have a difficult time with, which is the authority that the Pope has and the authority that the magisterium has to bind the consciences of the faithful in matters of doctrine or dogma. So Protestants at large will say that the Scripture is clear enough, it has perspicuity, it's clear enough such that we can figure out how to be reconciled to the Father through a relationship with Jesus. Whatever we think the gospel is, whatever we think it means to be saved, the bare bones definition of Christianity, we can derive that from Scripture. And so everything else, we're just sort of left on our own to figure out. So what do we think about contraception? And what do we think about just war? And what do we think about, any sort of social ethics question is just left up to individual pastors or congregations to decide. And Protestants have gotten really used to that over the years. So the idea that there's this one centralized office that can make definitive judgments on all these sorts of things was attractive to a Protestant like me. But to Protestants at large, it just sounds like draconian. That sounds like and especially if you're on the more libertarian end of things, like that, what do they do? What's Rome coming up here and getting in our business for? We can figure that stuff out. So I think Catholics don't realize this, but a lot of Protestants think of them as people who have surrendered their mental and spiritual faculties to a centralized office that does all their thinking for them. Right?
Interesting.
We have the Bible. We have a tradition of faithful biblical scholars who can help us figure out what this means. Why do we need some goofballs up in Rome that wear funny hats to tell us how to interpret this thing? So I think the authority issue, while it's attractive to a lot of people, and why it brings in a lot of Protestants, for that same reason, it can also keep a lot of folks out who think that the church is just overreaching here. We don't need to leave people alone. Like, let them love Jesus and follow Jesus without the institution.
It's like that video, I love Jesus but hate religion kind of thing. Yeah.
Now, even as a Protestant, I thought that video was really dumb. And the guy, didn't that guy actually come out later and say, "Sorry about that, I was wrong about it"?
Oh, I don't know. Did he?
I heard that he recanted a lot of it.
That's
but that whole pitting of religion versus relationship with Jesus, of course, as Catholics, we understand that totally differently.
Right.
But for Protestants, it's almost like, it's anti-establishment. So it's hippie theology, right? Jesus didn't come to found an institution; he came to found a movement, man. So let's just be a part of the movement, which is fine until you have to answer questions that even in the New Testament we see playing out. Do Gentiles and Jews, do new Gentile converts have to get circumcised? Yes or no, and who gets to decide?
Yeah.
Like, as soon as you run into a kind of concrete issue of Christian life and morals and faith and practice, you need somebody to figure it out. And I was getting increasingly uncomfortable as a Protestant with the idea that every individual pastor just gets to decide this stuff.
Yeah. No, that's good. So, this is only part one of our three-part segment, so we're going to stop here. So, St. Theresa, thank you so much for joining us on this first segment of St. Teresa's Round Table. On our next episode, we're going to be talking about ecumenism kind of at large. Basically, what do we do about Catholic-Protestant relations? What does that look like from like a big church scale, but also like into our individual lives? And then on the third episode, we're actually going to be talking about how do we go about evangelizing our non-Catholic brothers and sisters and what that looks like practically. So thank you so much for tuning in on this episode of St. Teresa's Roundtable. We'll see you next time. God bless.